All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second session of our leadership chat series at the Journal of Science Policy and Governance. Thank you for joining us today, and we also want to thank STEMPeers for sponsoring this series. My name is Nicole Parker, and I'm JSPG's Director of U.S. Outreach. And for those of you who are new to JSPG, JSPG is an open access, peer-reviewed publication dedicated to elevating students, postdocs, policy fellows, and young scholars in science, technology, and innovation policy and governance debate worldwide. In the chat, I'm going to provide some resources for you all to follow JSPG if you haven't done so already. All right. Okay. And so, as I stated earlier, this is our second session of the series. And if you missed our first session with JSPG's CEO, Adriana Bankston, you can view it on our YouTube webpage. And I'm also going to drop the link for that as well, so you can view it later at your own discretion. At this session, we welcome the Vice President for Policy and Global Affairs at the Association of American Universities, the American Association, my apologies, the Association of American Universities, better known as AAU, Toby Smith. Toby also has the pleasure of serving on the JSPG governing board and is an essential part of our efforts to ensure early career scientists become engaged in science policy. Toby, welcome today.
It's good to be here, Nicole.
And so, Toby, some of our followers probably do know you as a member of the JSPG governing board, but to get us started, can you explain how you entered into this role of science policy and how your current job impacts early career researchers?
Sure. So by way of background, I got my degree in general studies from the University of Michigan. So it was a broad-based degree, and I did not take a lot of science. I ended up working on Capitol Hill for my member of Congress right out of undergrad and got a master's in legislative affairs. And it was while working on Capitol Hill that I became familiar with the work of the University of Michigan office. A job opened up in the newly opened MIT Washington, D.C. office. I applied. I ended up getting a job as a legislative assistant there. It is interesting. They ask, well, you don't come from a scientific or technical background. Do you think that will hurt you working for a place like MIT? And part of my answer was no, because all the people work on Capitol Hill, they come from backgrounds like I did, political science, communications, history. And so I said, I will be the first line of defense in terms of helping to convey the importance of what, if I don't understand it, then they won't understand it. So I've often said my job has been as a translator and helping to kind of take the work of scientists and convey it to people who may not think of science or haven't gone through the same education, don't have the same background as many scientists do. So I did that. I worked at MIT for 7 years in the Washington office. Then I worked for the Vice President for Research in Washington, doing a combination of congressional relations and research development, working with the agencies for the University of Michigan for their Vice President for Research, again in Washington, in the Washington, D.C. office for the University of Michigan. Then I came to AAU after 3.5 years, where I've been now over 18 years. AAU represents the leading research universities in the US. We have 2 Canadian members. They're public and private. So that's how I came to where I am.
Nice. And as you've been on this journey and in your career, can you name a few pivotal experiences that demonstrated how early career researchers could really have a seat at the table in policy?
Yeah, so I often tell folks, and this was demonstrated very early on in my career at MIT, when a group of undergraduates had an issue that they went to the provost on, and they said, we actually want to go to Washington because this affects us. Mm-hmm. So I took those undergraduates around to executive branch agencies, and I just realized how effective they were as communicators, because in some sense, they aren't like a lab director. They don't have employees. They are not as vested. It's their future. So it was really great to take them around. It made me realize that students actually are some of the best voices for us when we talk about what research universities do and why they're important, why the long tradition we have in the US of integrating research with education is important, because these students were all being funded off of research grants in the University Research Opportunities Program, the Europe program at MIT.
Mm-hmm.
I've also, another experience that I'll just share real quickly was that I, working for MIT, worked on the one of the big programs MIT has, they still have, they had then, was that they have a big magnetic fusion program.
Mm-hmm.
I was responsible for advocating for the work that the Fusion Center, the Plasma Fusion Center at MIT did. And Senator Kennedy, his staffer, often when I tried to engage her on fusion, would not respond to me. She just wasn't interested. The one time when I got a call from her was when a group of the graduate students were concerned about the future of the lab, and they wrote a letter to Senator Kennedy, and that staffer called the office and said, hey, can you tell me who the lead on this letter was from the graduate students? Because Senator Kennedy really cares about students. He wants to be in touch and communicate with them. And so I need to find out, and I don't want to write everybody. We didn't, so I did that, but it tells, I often say that again, students are not seen. Sometimes if you take senior scientists in and they don't quite speak the language that politicians understand, they're seen as egotistical, arrogant, they don't understand. If you take students in,
Mm-hmm.
they speak that same language because they just are talking about research. They're seen as smart, bright, boy, they're our future. So I think there's more leeway and appreciation for that when a student is really smart about research. There's a view that more senior people should be able to talk in a language that others use on the Hill.
Yeah, and that's really encouraging to hear, because I know a lot of people interested in JSPG or interested in submitting to JSPG are trying to break into policy, or they're scientists and they might have an interest and just want to make sure that they can actually make an impact and that it's worth their time. So another question that I have for you, as an early career researcher, maybe someone who is still on the bench or hasn't quite crossed over into the policy world yet, what kind of skills should they hone in on, and what type of resources should they seek in order to kind of break into this policy world?
So I think one is to understand policy issues. So trying to know a little bit about how policy works, how it's created, how science policy works. I'm a big advocate of trying to take, sometimes it's hard for students I know to find the time to take a science policy course. They aren't always offered, but participating in AAAS meetings where there's discussions of science policy, learning about science policy is one area. I don't think you have to necessarily get a whole degree in it though. Second area I would say is communication and understanding. And this is where work like the Alan Alda Center for Science Communications, trying to teach scientists how to talk to non-scientists is so important. It gets back to that translation role that I talked about. My job, I've often felt that I compare my job to one, that I do cross-cultural communications. It really is knowing how to take what you say, what you know, and translate it in language that non-scientists can understand. And Alda actually talks about something called the curse of knowledge, not remembering what it's like not to know what you know. And I think a lot of even graduate students have that challenge. That's one of the reasons I've always thought undergraduates are good who are involved in research, because they're still trying to explain to their parents or their roommates in the dorm who are not in science what they're doing and why it matters. So I think that communications piece is really important, being concise, not using language that is the language we speak really matters. I'm just going to give you an example because I think it's a great one. We talk about basic research. Everybody knows what basic research is in our world. But focus groups have shown sometimes that when you suggest that the government's funding basic research, people who don't know science say, why are we doing basic research? Shouldn't we be doing hard, really tough science? So language matters. We often just forget that, and scientists forget it, and they need to work on that translational piece and bringing it down to terms that lay people can understand. I mean, non-scientists can understand.
Yeah. Wow, that is a great anecdote because I've never actually thought about that before as someone who typically uses the basic science term all the time. And when I use basic outside of science, it does mean, something that's not so great. So thank you for sharing that story. That was actually really helpful to know. And of course, the communication piece, communication is number one in science policy. And so I think that was very helpful advice. Another thing that we want to get into is, as you know, JSPG, we recently published our special issue inspired by Science, the Endless Frontier. And this was in collaboration with AAAS and sponsored by the Kavli Foundation. As we celebrated the 75th anniversary of this text, many of us were thinking about the future of science policy and how we can fully be engaged in it. Based on this, I have a few questions that I'm going to go through. But the first question that I have is, what do you see as the current trends and hot topics in science policy today? And how different are they from Vannevar Bush's ideas?
So some of them are very different. Some of them are rooted in debates that actually happened when Vannevar Bush was pushing science, the endless frontier. And they were debates that he won, but they're constantly under reconsideration. What do I mean? Bush believed that scientists were the best able to determine what science should be funded. But there's been a debate going back to the creation of the NSF about is it scientists, or should some of this be distributed versus on a more geographical basis? Mm-hmm. Kind of equity. Excellence, or Bush would argue that peer review was excellent. We're funding the best scientists based upon what scientists said, versus equity and distributing funds for science across the country. We've gone with peer review. That was Bush's idea, but there is a push right now in Congress to reconsider that. And we've had programs like the EPSCoR program, which provides funding to, it's competitive funding, but it goes to certain states that aren't getting large amounts of funding, like Massachusetts and California. And right now, in real time, we're having that debate about that issue, as well as other institutions, HBCUs, for instance. We don't have any HBCUs that are R1s or research intensive, highly research intensive universities, according to Carnegie classification. So and how do we redress some of those issues in terms of funding for science and build capacity in institutions that perhaps didn't always have the best scientists, and so they couldn't win those competitive grants, but for various reasons, one of them has to do with ensuring that we have a diverse set of scientists, going forward. And that's a big issue. And I think as people have become much more tuned into some of the issues regarding diversity, equity, inclusion, that's an important one. Another issue is Bush believed that one of the great things was this idea that if we fund grants at universities, we'll have scientists who can train the next generation of scientists, this apprenticeship model. Mm-hmm. I think that's being reconsidered, though, because I just told you some skills that scientists should have. But if you're taught just that your job is to do the research and become exactly a clone of your advisor, you're losing a set of skills. And let's face it, a lot of researchers are not getting jobs in academia. They are not becoming top scientists at research universities, the university that I represent. They go out and work in industry, or they go into policy. So I do think this apprenticeship model needs to be broadened. We need to train students differently. I think that's being reconsidered. Reconsidered also in the reward structure of what we value amongst researchers, that maybe it's a broader skill than just the number of papers that you can publish and the type of journal they're in. I'll give one more example, and that is that Bush believed that the government's role in funding science was, it should be funding that fundamental early stage research. The government didn't have a role in applied research or technology. There was a New Deal Democrat from West Virginia, Harley Kilgore, who believed and actually had created in 1942 introduced legislation to create not a national science foundation, but a national technology foundation. So what's the debate that's going on now?
Sounds familiar.
Should we add a new technology directorate to the National Science Foundation as part of what? The Endless Frontiers Act. So this is a debate that we had back then. It's a debate that's shifting. I think there will be some new technology directorate added to the NSF. We'll see how that shapes out, but it is a debate that, as I often say, President Truman once said, "There's nothing new in the world except the history you don't know." And these debates we often have repeat themselves in science policy and elsewhere.
Yeah, agreed. And I have to use this opportunity because you did bring up workforce and education a bit in your response. And so I do want to just highlight for our participants that JSPG recently did just issue a call out for papers for our STEM education and workforce issue that's sponsored by Sigma Chi. So certainly we're going to have a series of webinars rolling out for that, in which we think a lot of this information that Toby's touching on now will be covered within those sessions. So I will definitely drop the link to that as well in the chat during this time. So another question I have, we kind of talked about how, recent events, current events over the last, few decades or so have definitely shifted what current science policy looks like, and it differs from what we saw 75 years ago. But, we've all been living through this COVID-19 pandemic these past 2 years, and specifically pertaining to the pandemic, how do you feel that's impacted the future of science policy? What type of large impact has this pandemic had to shift how we view science policy today?
So I'll say two things on that one. First of all, it's had positive impacts. It's also had some negative impacts. What do I mean? We know, and we are doing polling here at AAU that has really shown that the pandemic and the fact that the vaccine was really generated through research that came out of our universities, has really galvanized support for particularly research in the biomedical and health sciences. And that is clear. That's been a positive, as on one hand, people recognize more than ever the benefits of science. At the same time, though, we've seen science politicized in ways that aren't necessarily positive. And the uncertainty of science and the fact that science isn't static. And I'll use the example of mask wearing. And the fact that we know that at the beginning of this pandemic, folks like Tony Fauci did say, and we don't think you need to wear a mask. And then science caught up and understood that this was an airborne virus. And that position changed. But there were people in politics who confuse people by not talking about how science evolves, how science moves, how science learns. And that there's a great article in the Christian Science Monitor called "In a Polarized World, What Does It Mean to Follow Science?" I don't think a lot of people out there know what it means that science doesn't stay static. And that was part of people got confused, and they've been able to twist facts for, I think, unfortunate and not positive reasons in ways that I worry about. I think scientists need to be careful also not to politicize science, because I often talk about how science doesn't have a right or wrong answer. It informs decisions and policies, and you need to take it into account, but it doesn't tell you the right policy answer. And those are always going to be political decisions. That's why we really do need to make sure people understand how science works.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thank you for that. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and ask a question related to your position as a governing board member for JSPG. So as a governing board member, what do you think the value of the journal is for the next generation of leaders in science policy?
So this one, I said my focus was general studies, but I really was a political scientist and hung around the political science department at the University of Michigan. That's what I did. And I was co-editor-in-chief of something called the Michigan Journal of Political Science. And it was a journal in which folks who were, undergraduates and graduate students could publish political science articles. And I came to realize how valuable that was to get published. In fact, when I was here in Washington in graduate school, I got a paper published in the journal. I think JSPG serves that same purpose and gives scientists an opportunity who want to play a role in policy to get their views out, to publish important pieces early on in their careers. And I think we talked about the issue on the Endless Frontier. I played a role in helping to facilitate that. I just feel it's really important. For the same reason I think it's important for young people to go to the Hill and express their views, it's also important to have outlets to talk about science policy, because it's the early career researchers whose future really matters, and they're the ones who have the biggest stake in the outcomes, and the changes that are being made in policy today will affect their future going forward. So I think JSPG is a great way to allow for that, to enable people to get papers published in policy where there aren't that many outlets to do that, especially for folks who may be new to policy.
Yeah. And as a board member, can you speak to some of the opportunities that there are to get involved with JSPG?
So I know there are a lot of, because it's a volunteer, largely a volunteer organization, right? I mean, there's editorial positions, there are publicity positions, positions like Adriana has. I mean, there's lots of leadership opportunities. So I think those are great opportunities you also learn by editing, as I knew, because I read lots of papers as an undergrad when I was co-editor-in-chief of the Political Science Journal. I think there's just a lot of great opportunities. The other thing is just the opportunity, again, to submit and write papers and publish in the journal.
Absolutely. And as I mentioned earlier, also just attending our webinars and our workshops. Even I know a lot of folks, and I include myself as one of them as a student, it can be very intimidating to write something that you're unfamiliar with. We're very used to a very certain academic style, and just, coming to webinars. And I'll also mention that Toby will be moderating one of our webinars that are coming up next month for our workforce series. So please do look out for that. But just attending those webinars and workshops really can give you some more insight into what science policy is, and also provide you with new names and connections of people who you can definitely reach out to get more information as well.
Nicole, let me just add, because I think it's really important, and JSPG has done a great job of offering different types of writing opportunities, the memo competition, the policy memo competition, which is a very different style of writing than writing for a scientific publication. Similarly, I think that the edition we talked about was, writing short policy papers. When you write for policymakers, they can't be long 30-page articles.
Yeah.
Lots of stats and figures. They have to be written for that audience. So I think it's a great opportunity to test and challenge yourself to write to a different audience as well.
Absolutely. And I would argue that it also helps you be able to convey your science to non-academic audiences in a better way as well. So even if policy isn't the route for you at all around, it's just a good way to kind of learn different communication styles. So thank you for adding that, Toby. So we have a few more minutes left. And so I have a couple more questions, and some of these are from the audience. And thank you for submitting your questions as you registered. We really appreciate that. So one question we have is, how do you keep up persistence in science policy despite all the challenges and still maintain your work-life balance?
It's a good question. I think part of it depends on where you come from, because I come from a non-science, this is my career. I love it. So like with any career, you try and balance you try and figure out how much time do I want to spend doing this,
Mm-hmm.
and how much then I've got a family, I've got kids. You have to figure out the other things that are important and then split that time. I do think one of the challenges for particularly STEM graduate students is how they find the time to involve themselves in policy in a demanding STEM field where they're under pressure to publish their scientific work, they're under pressure to be in the lab, and finding that time to take even a short course in science policy is difficult. And that's, I don't know that I have any answers, except that I think we have to change the culture to recognize, for the same reason I was talking about the reconsideration of the apprenticeship model, that we need people with diverse backgrounds. I often give the talk about the makeup of Congress. We need scientists in Congress.
Absolutely.
We need scientists who work for members of Congress. They think differently. They understand how science works, and that only helps make the policy process more robust. So I think we need to figure out how to try and change it so there is more ability to balance those different skill sets that scientists need.
Yeah, absolutely. And when it comes to, just thinking about as a student, I was on a call before and a panelist mentioned, sometimes when you're balancing that act while you're in graduate school or you're doing your postdoc, your PI doesn't need to know everything, right? So it's just, you have to find a way to fit in the things that you care about. And yeah, as far as work-life balance, I do believe, that is something that everyone has to figure out no matter what industry you go into. And particularly, I think every job and field has some downers and some uppers. So it's just, you have to take the cards however they lay. So thank you. And then so I have one more audience question, and you might need a little bit of time to think about it, but what is your favorite policy related book to read? Or do you have one?
I do have a book that I recommend, and it's by Stephen Johnson, and I'm trying to remember the name. It's on innovation. And I think it's an ecological approach to innovation, but he is a award-winning New York Times scientist, writer, not a scientist, but he's writing about science and how science really works. And I think one of the points is oftentimes science doesn't just happen. It's not like the eureka moment and we find something. It's more that two ideas come together at the right time. And he writes in a book about the computer and how somebody came up with the concept for the computer long before the computer could be there. And they couldn't make it work because the technology hadn't caught up.
Right.
So he talks about the adjacent possible. It's very interesting, and it's kind of the way he approaches it. So that's a recommended book that I think is an easy read. It's a read that not only will appeal to scientists, but the general public as well. And I enjoyed reading it. So that's my recommendation.
Great. And if you do remember the title, feel free to email it to us later, and we'll definitely share it with the group here. All right. Well, do you have any additional thoughts for us today before we sign off?
I don't know that I do. I think I've touched on some of the things just already in terms of the importance of being able to communicate, taking time to understand policy, and being involved in things like JSPG, which I just think is a great thing that you all do, and am really pleased to help contribute to it by serving on the governing board.
Well, thank you so much, Toby. We really appreciated all your thought-provoking responses to our questions today. I'm sure our listeners have learned a lot about the future of science policy and also how they can intersect with science policy going forward. And so to our listeners, I really hope you enjoyed this fireside chat. We're going to continue this series throughout the year. And so please stay tuned for our next chat that will be held on Thursday, October 14th. Information will be going out about that very soon. Did you want to chime in?
The name of the book is Innovation, Where Good Ideas Come From. So I was
Yes.
able to Google it really quickly and find it. So
Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to have to look that up myself as well. But thank you, everyone, and we will see you next time.